You want to know how quickly a man can destroy everything he never knew he needed? Watch a duke dance with his mistress at his pregnant wife's birthday, while 200 aristocrats hold their breath. Because some betrayals don't whisper, they waltz. This is the story of Cedric Ravenshire, a man who thought power meant never having to choose, who believed his wife's silence was acceptance rather than strategy, who learned far too late that the woman wearing the perfect smile was already planning her escape. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll see exactly what happens when a duchess stops pretending and a duke realizes he's been holding smoke while throwing away gold. Because the real tragedy isn't the fall itself. It's finally understanding what you had only after watching it walk away forever. The chandeliers in Blackthorn Palace's grand ballroom burned with enough candles to light a small village for a week. Cedric Ravenshire stood near the musicians' gallery with a glass of champagne he hadn't touched, watching his wife move through the crowd with that unnerving grace she'd perfected over 3 years of marriage. Evelyn wore ivory silk that accommodated her 6-month pregnancy without losing elegance, diamonds at her throat that had belonged to his grandmother, and an expression of serene contentment that he'd long since stopped trying to decode. 21 years old today, still so young, still so composed, still so utterly unreachable despite sharing his bed and his name. Lord Ashford cornered him near the refreshment tables, breathing expensive whiskey and political ambition. The older man clapped Cedric's shoulder with the familiarity of someone who'd contributed significantly to the Ravenshire campaign funds. "Your wife looks radiant, Your Grace. Pregnancy suits her. The whole kingdom is holding its breath for the heir." Cedric offered the smile he'd learned from his father, the one that revealed nothing and promised everything. "She's been in excellent health. The physicians are optimistic. And you?" Ashford's eyes gleamed with the particular malice of men who traded in gossip disguised as concern. Fatherhood approaching, responsibilities mounting. These are weighty times for a young duke. I've never shied from responsibility. "No," Ashford agreed, his gaze drifting across the ballroom to where Evelyn stood with a cluster of noble wives, her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. "Though some responsibilities command more attention than others, I imagine." The words carried implications Cedric chose not to examine. He'd become expert at not examining things, at keeping different parts of his life in separate chambers like rooms in the palace that never connected. Evelyn in the East Wing with her charity work and impeccable public appearances. Selina in the townhouse on Merchant Street where he disappeared 3 evenings a week under cover of political meetings and estate business. It had worked perfectly for 3 years. The orchestra finished a waltz. Cedric checked his pocket watch, a nervous habit he'd developed recently. 8:15. Selina would arrive any moment now. He'd arranged it carefully, sent the invitation himself, told her to come late enough that her entrance wouldn't overshadow Evelyn's moment, but early enough to still be respectable. Because despite everything, despite the complications and the necessary deceptions, he wanted her here tonight. Wanted both of them here, if he was being honest with himself. Which he rarely was. "Your Grace." The palace steward appeared at his elbow, voice low and urgent. "There's a situation at the entrance requiring your attention." "What kind of situation?" "A lady has arrived without proper escort. The guards are uncertain about protocol given the circumstances." Cedric felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew before asking. "Selina?" The steward's expression confirmed it. "She insists she received an invitation directly from you." "She did." Cedric set down his champagne glass with more force than necessary. "I'll handle this myself." He crossed the ballroom with long strides, aware of conversations pausing as he passed, of eyes following his progress. The Ravenshire presence, his father had called it. The weight that made other men step aside and lower their voices. Cedric had cultivated it carefully, had learned to wear power like a second skin. But power, he was beginning to understand, created as many problems as it solved. The entrance hall glittered with marble and gaslight. Selina stood near the doors in a gown of deep scarlet that transformed her from the secret he'd kept for 3 years into a declaration of war. The color alone announced everything he'd tried to hide. The cut revealed shoulders he'd kissed in private, curves he'd memorized in darkness, beauty that had never been meant for public consumption. She smiled when she saw him. Not the careful smile of mistresses who understood their place, but the radiant smile of women who believed they'd already won. "Cedric." Her voice carried across the marble, warm and familiar and utterly inappropriate. I was beginning to think the guards wouldn't let me pass. He reached her in 3 strides, took her elbow with fingers that pressed too hard. "What are you doing?" "You invited me." Her eyes held challenge beneath the charm. "Don't you remember? You said you wanted me to see the palace, to be part of your world. Not like this, not tonight. Why not tonight? Because it's my wife's birthday. Because 200 aristocrats are watching. Because you're wearing red to a formal ball like a courtesan advertising services." He didn't say any of it. Instead, he felt his hand slide from her elbow to her fingers, felt himself doing the exact thing he knew he shouldn't, the thing that would shatter whatever fragile pretense still remained. "Come with me." The ballroom doors opened. Cedric led Selena through them with her hand in his, and the orchestra stumbled over a chord before recovering. The silence that followed felt like physics reversing, like gravity failing, like the moment before a bridge collapses when everyone can see the structure failing, but no one can stop the fall. Every head turned. Every conversation died. Cedric felt their stares like physical weight, felt the scandal crystallizing in real time, felt the future he'd carefully constructed beginning to crack. But Selena's hand was warm in his, her perfume familiar, her presence after 3 years of shadows and secrets suddenly, inexplicably necessary. He'd spent 3 years keeping her hidden. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't articulate even to himself, he needed her visible, needed everyone to see what he'd chosen. The orchestra restarted, filling the terrible silence with something Viennese and forgettable. Cedric led Selena to the center of the dance floor, placed his hand at her waist, and began to waltz while 200 aristocrats watched his marriage publicly implode. Across the ballroom, Evelyn stood with her champagne glass raised halfway to her lips. Their eyes met across the sea of scandalized faces. Her expression didn't change. The perfect smile remained perfectly in place. But something in her eyes died so completely that Cedric felt it like a door slamming somewhere deep in his chest. Then she lifted her glass higher in a toast only he could understand, and drank while still smiling. The dance ended. Cedric released Selena but didn't step away. Around them, the ballroom felt frozen, every guest caught between outrage and fascination, between fleeing the scandal and witnessing history. Lord Ashford approached with the careful steps of men navigating disasters. "Your Grace, perhaps we should discuss the timber contracts in your study." It was an escape route, thinly veiled. A chance to remove himself, to claim temporary insanity, to begin the damage control that might salvage something from this catastrophic lapse in judgment. Cedric looked at Selena, looked at Evelyn across the ballroom, still smiling that terrible smile, looked at the future stretching before him like a chess game where he'd just sacrificed his queen for no tactical advantage whatsoever. "No," he heard himself say. "I think it's time everyone understood the situation clearly." The words came from somewhere deeper than thought, from the place where resentment festered over 3 years of pretending, 3 years of perfect Duchess performances, and cold marital duty, and a wife who gave him everything except whatever it was he actually needed. "Selena will be remaining at Blackthorn Palace," Cedric announced to the silent ballroom, "as a close family companion." The gasps sounded like wind through dead trees. Evelyn set down her champagne glass with the precision of someone placing a chess piece. She crossed the ballroom slowly, her pregnancy making her movements measured and deliberate, her ivory gown whispering against marble floors. Nobles parted before her like water before a hull. She stopped 3 feet from Cedric, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to ensure every word carried across the ballroom's perfect acoustics. "A close family companion," she repeated. Her voice held no emotion whatsoever, which somehow made it more devastating than rage. "How generous of you to expand our household on my birthday." "Evelyn, no." She raised one hand, still wearing his grandmother's rings. "You've made your announcement. Let me make mine." She turned to face the assembled aristocracy, her hand moving to rest over her unborn child, her posture straight despite the weight she carried. When she spoke, her voice remained calm and clear and absolutely final. "I will not raise my child in a house where humiliation is celebrated as hospitality." The ballroom held its breath. "I will not teach my son or daughter that love means accepting public disrespect for the sake of appearances. I will not become the ghost of a woman pretending her husband's cruelty is kindness." Cedric felt something like panic beginning to rise. Evelyn, you're being dramatic. We can discuss this privately. We've discussed everything privately for 3 years. She met his eyes, and for the first time since their wedding, he saw her clearly. Saw the intelligence he'd underestimated, the strength he'd dismissed as compliance, the fury she'd compressed into perfect manners while he'd mistaken her silence for acceptance. Tonight, she said quietly, everyone learns the truth together. She removed her wedding ring with steady hands, placed it beside the untouched birthday cake that bore her name in sugar flowers, and stepped back. I am leaving tonight. Not tomorrow after careful consideration, not next week after consulting lawyers, not in a month after salvaging your reputation. Tonight. Now. While everyone watches. The panic in Cedric's chest bloomed into something close to terror. You're carrying my heir. I'm carrying my child. Evelyn touched her belly again, protective and possessive. Who will grow up knowing their mother chose dignity over dynasty? This is insane. You can't just leave. There are legal implications, financial arrangements, the succession. There's also human decency. She turned toward the ballroom doors. But I understand you've forgotten what that looks like. Evelyn, stop. She paused without turning back. No, Cedric. For the first time in 3 years, I'm starting. Then she walked toward the doors with her head high and her shoulders straight, past aristocrats too shocked to speak, past the musicians who'd stopped playing entirely, past the life she'd performed with such flawless execution that he'd actually believed she was content. The doors closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. Cedric stood alone on the dance floor beside his mistress in red, surrounded by 200 witnesses to his spectacular miscalculation, holding power and title and wealth that suddenly felt like holding smoke. Lord Ashford cleared his throat. Your Grace, perhaps now we should— Get out! Cedric's voice came out hoarse. All of you, the celebration is over. No one moved immediately. They stood frozen in Scandal's gravitational pull, desperate to witness what happened next, how the mighty Ravenshire Duke would handle the Duchess, who'd just publicly destroyed him. I said leave! Cedric roared at this time, and finally they moved, a slow exodus of silk and judgment and whispered outrage that would fuel drawing-room conversations for the next decade. Selina touched his arm. Cedric, darling, perhaps we should— Don't. He pulled away from her, seeing her clearly for the first time, seeing the scarlet gown that had seemed bold transform into costume, the beauty that had seemed essential reveal itself as merely decorative, the love he'd thought was profound expose itself as nothing more than the attention he'd mistaken for devotion. You should go too. Her face went pale beneath the cosmetics. You don't mean that. He looked at her, this woman he'd risked everything for, this woman he'd thought was worth destroying his marriage over, and felt nothing but the cold mathematics of consequences. I'll have your things sent to Merchant Street. The townhouse lease expires at month's end. Cedric? Selina. His voice carried all the authority he'd inherited with the dukedom, all the power that had failed him so spectacularly tonight. This is not a negotiation. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through shock and hurt, and finally settling on something like contempt. Then she turned and left through the same doors Evelyn had used, her scarlet gown trailing like blood across the marble. Cedric stood alone in the empty ballroom beneath 1,000 candles burning for a celebration that had ended in ruins. Servants began appearing to clear champagne glasses and untouched hors d'oeuvres, moving around him like he was furniture, like he'd already become the ghost haunting his own palace. The birthday cake remained on the center table, Evelyn's name written in perfect script, her wedding ring gleaming beside it like a promise broken. He picked up the ring. It was still warm from her finger. Somewhere in the palace above him, he heard doors opening and closing, voices giving urgent instructions, the sounds of his wife packing to leave him. He should go to her, should explain, should find the words to make her understand that it wasn't about loving Selina more, it was about resenting the performance their marriage had become, the careful choreography of aristocratic duty that left no room for anything real. But his feet wouldn't move, his voice wouldn't come, and somewhere deeper than pride or panic, in the place where instinct lived before thought could dress it in justification, Cedric understood with terrible clarity that Evelyn had been waiting 3 years for him to give her permission to leave. Tonight, he'd given it to her in front of everyone who mattered. By midnight, her chambers would be empty. By morning, the scandal would be in every newspaper in the kingdom. By next week, the political alliances would begin crumbling. By next month, the investors would start withdrawing support. And Cedric would still be standing here, holding a ring that belonged to a woman who'd learned something he was only beginning to understand, that sometimes the only power left is the power to walk away. The head of palace security appeared in the ballroom doorway. "Your Grace, the Duchess has requested a carriage to the coast road. Stop her." The man's expression held pity Cedric didn't want to see. "Your Grace, she's asked that I inform you any attempt to prevent her departure will result in her making a formal complaint to the royal court. For unlawful imprisonment. She wouldn't dare. With respect, Your Grace, tonight suggests the Duchess would dare quite a lot." Cedric sank into the nearest chair, still holding the ring. Through the windows, he could see torches moving in the palace courtyard, servants loading trunks into a carriage, his wife preparing to leave him in the middle of the night like a thief escaping prison. "Let her go," he said finally, the words tasting like ash. "She'll come back when she calms down. This is her home." The security chief said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The carriage wheels sounded on cobblestones outside. Cedric crossed to the window and watched Evelyn climb into the coach without looking back at the palace. She moved with the same grace she'd shown all evening, the same perfect composure, the same unreadable expression. Except now he understood. It hadn't been acceptance. It had been strategy. The carriage rolled through the palace gates and disappeared into the night, carrying his wife and his unborn child toward a future that no longer included him. Cedric stood at the window until dawn began breaking over the eastern hills, until the last candles burned out and left him in darkness, until the servants stopped pretending to work and simply abandoned him to the ballroom that would never be used again. And somewhere in the empty palace, in the silence that followed spectacle, the Duke of Ravenshire began to understand what he'd done. But understanding came too late, as it always does, for men who mistake their wife's patience for weakness and her silence for surrender. What Cedric couldn't know, standing alone in that ruined ballroom, was that Evelyn had stopped crying over him 6 months ago, that she'd been planning this escape since the day she'd confirmed her pregnancy, since the moment she'd realized she was bringing a child into a marriage built on performance and neglect, that every smile, every perfect Duchess appearance, every gracious public moment had been armor she was forging for exactly this night. He couldn't know that the coastal province of Norhaven held her late father's shipping business, dormant for years but still legally hers, waiting to be rebuilt by a woman who'd learned aristocratic strategy and political maneuvering from 3 years of survival in his world. He couldn't know that his wife had been underestimated her entire life, had learned to use that underestimation like a weapon, had walked away from him already winning a war he didn't realize had started. But he would learn. They all would, because the Duchess of Ravenshire had just done something unprecedented in aristocratic society. She'd chosen herself over dynasty, dignity over duty, truth over the beautiful lie of noble marriage. And the kingdom was about to discover that the quiet ones, the smiling ones, the ones who seemed so perfectly content in their golden cages were often just waiting for the right moment to break free. Evelyn's moment had been tonight. Cedric's reckoning was only beginning. The carriage wheels had barely faded into silence before the palace began to rot from the inside out. Cedric stood in that empty ballroom until the servants stopped pretending to clean and started whispering instead. Their voices carried through the corridors like poison in bloodstream, spreading the story faster than any newspaper could print it. The Duke's mistress in scarlet, the Duchess walking out at midnight, the wedding ring left beside a birthday cake no one had eaten. By dawn, 3 members of the household staff had resigned. By noon, the scandal had reached the financial district. By evening, Cedric understood that Evelyn hadn't just left him. She'd detonated their entire world on her way out the door. He found the first letter on his desk at sunrise, still wearing yesterday's formal clothes that smelled like failure and expensive champagne. Lord Pemberton's handwriting, usually steady, looked shaken across the page. Your Grace, given recent developments affecting the Ravenshire reputation, I must reluctantly withdraw my family's support from the Northern Railway investment. The political climate has become untenable for continued association. I trust you understand this is a matter of prudence rather than personal judgment. Cedric crushed the letter in his fist. Prudence. The coward's word for abandonment. The second letter arrived before he'd finished reading the third. Lord Ashford, who'd been breathing political ambition in his face just 12 hours ago, now writing with the distant formality of men covering their own backs. The consortium has decided to postpone the timber contracts pending resolution of certain domestic matters that may impact your ability to fulfill long-term obligations. Domestic matters. As if his wife leaving was a plumbing issue to be resolved by competent staff. By midday, 5 more letters. By evening, a dozen. Investors withdrawing. Political allies discovering urgent business elsewhere. Noble families suddenly remembering prior commitments that prevented future collaboration. Cedric watched his empire crumble in real time, measured in canceled meetings and rescinded invitations, in the careful language of aristocrats who could smell blood in the water and wanted no part of the feeding frenzy. His private secretary appeared in the study doorway, looking like a man bringing news of plague. Your Grace, the royal court has sent an inquiry regarding the Duchess's current whereabouts and well-being. Tell them she's visiting family. Your Grace, the court specifically mentions they've received communication from the Duchess herself, requesting their awareness of her situation. Cedric's jaw clenched hard enough to hurt. She contacted them directly? This morning. She's apparently made it clear that her departure was voluntary but necessary due to circumstances she felt compelled to escape. The phrasing hit like a fist to the gut. Circumstances she felt compelled to escape. Not a temporary absence, not a cooling-off period, not even a dramatic gesture to be soothed with apologies and promises. Escape, like he was a prison she'd been plotting to break out of for years. Where is she? The secretary hesitated. I'm not certain you want to know, Your Grace. Tell me anyway. The Norhaven Coast. Her father's old shipping company. That worthless enterprise? Cedric laughed, harsh and bitter. 3 warehouses and a fleet of rotting boats. What does she think she's going to accomplish there? The secretary's expression suggested he had theories but wasn't stupid enough to voice them. Shall I prepare a carriage? Perhaps if you went to her explained, No. Your Grace, she wants to play the wounded wife fleeing persecution? Fine. Let her sit in some coastal hovel until she remembers what actual hardship feels like. She'll come crawling back within a month. The secretary nodded, but his eyes said what his mouth wouldn't. That Cedric was deluding himself. That the Duchess who'd orchestrated last night's surgical destruction of her own marriage wasn't the type to come crawling anywhere. But Cedric needed to believe it. Needed to believe Evelyn would realize she'd overreacted. That pregnancy hormones had driven her to dramatic extremes. That leaving him meant leaving everything that mattered. The title, the wealth, the position, the power. What else could possibly matter to a woman raised in that world? The days that followed taught him exactly how wrong a man could be. The newspapers erupted first, not the respectable broadsheets that covered aristocratic events with careful neutrality, but the scandal sheets that fed on noble misery like vultures on carrion. They ran competing headlines, each more lurid than the last. Duchess flees palace. In midnight escape. Ravenshire. Heir unborn as marriage collapses, the Scarlet Woman, and the birthday betrayal. But worse than the headlines were the editorials. Journalists who'd praised Cedric's political acumen now writing poison disguised as analysis. Public sentiment crystallizing not into the scandalized condemnation of a wife abandoning her husband, but into something far more dangerous. Sympathy for Evelyn. One editorial in particular haunted him, written by a society columnist known for ruthless observation. The Duchess of Ravenshire spent 3 years performing perfection for a husband who mistook her grace for contentment and her patience for permission. Last night, she reminded us all that silence is not the same as surrender, and that the women we underestimate are often the ones planning their escapes while we sleep. If the Duke expected his wife to endure public humiliation with the same composure she showed to private neglect, he fundamentally misunderstood what he married. Not a decoration, a strategist. Cedric threw the newspaper across his study hard enough to scatter pages like wounded birds. His head of household staff knocked on the doorframe, looking older than he had a week ago. Your Grace, 3 more servants have given notice. The head cook, the under-butler, and one of the upstairs maids. Why? They say the atmosphere has become intolerable. The atmosphere. as if misery had become contagious, spreading through the palace like fever. Tell them their wages will be increased 15% if they stay. I already did, Your Grace. They declined, because serving a duke abandoned by his wife was social poison, because being associated with Blackthorn Palace now meant being associated with scandal and failure, and a man who'd publicly humiliated a pregnant woman on her birthday. Cedric started drinking before noon, not the refined sipping of aristocratic leisure, but the determined consumption of men trying to drown thoughts that kept surfacing like corpses in a river. Selena appeared at the palace 3 days after the disaster, slipping past the reduced security like she'd done 100 times before. She found him in his study, surrounded by financial reports that all told the same story: collapse, Cedric. Her voice held manufactured sympathy, the kind that came from someone who decided to play the role of supportive lover, now that the mistress position had exploded. I've been so worried about you. He looked at her standing in his doorway wearing a dress of modest blue instead of that damned scarlet, her expression carefully arranged into concern, and felt nothing but the cold mathematics of cause and effect. You should leave. Don't be ridiculous. You need someone right now, and I'm here. You're here because you have nowhere else to be. The townhouse lease expired yesterday. I assume you've been staying at that boarding house on Merchant Street? Her face went pale. How did you? I own half the properties in that district. Did you think I wouldn't know? Cedric, please. She moved toward him, reaching out. We can start over, without all the pretense and hiding. She's gone now. We can finally... Finally what? He stood, and she stepped back from whatever she saw in his face. Turn you into the next Duchess? Let you play the role she performed for 3 years while the entire kingdom watches and judges and tears apart everything you do because you're the woman who destroyed a marriage? I didn't destroy anything. You chose me. I chose wrong. The words came out flat and final. Selena stared at him like he'd struck her. You don't mean that. I chose wrong, Cedric repeated, hearing the truth of it even as he spoke. I chose 3 years of easy affection over a wife I never bothered to understand. I chose flattery over partnership. I chose the woman who made me feel powerful instead of the woman who actually was powerful. Evelyn is weak. Selena's voice turned sharp, defensive. She ran away instead of fighting for her marriage. She ran away from a marriage I'd already killed. Cedric poured another whiskey, his hands steadier than they should be. She just waited until I was stupid enough to parade the murder weapon in front of 200 witnesses. So what now? Selena's tears looked real, but he'd stopped trusting his ability to read women 3 days ago. You're just going to give up? Let her win? She already won. Cedric drank and felt the burn that didn't help anymore. The moment she walked out that door, she won everything that mattered. Public sympathy, moral authority, the freedom to rebuild her life without the weight of my spectacular failure dragging her down. While I get to stand here holding the ashes of everything I destroyed and pretending it was worth it. We can still salvage this. Selena moved closer, desperate now. If you went to her, apologized. She wouldn't believe me. He met Selena's eyes and saw her finally understanding. And she'd be right not to. Because I'm only sorry now that I'm facing consequences. 3 days ago, I thought I could have everything. My wife's respectability, your companionship, the kingdom's respect, unlimited power. Now I have none of it. So yes, I'm very sorry. But not in any way that would make a difference to her. Then what do you want from me? Nothing. The word came out gentler than he intended. I want nothing from you, Selena. I probably never did. I just wanted escape from a marriage I resented without ever asking why I resented it. Because she didn't love you. Because I didn't love her, Cedric corrected. Or I loved the idea of her more than the reality. The perfect Duchess, the flawless performance, the woman who never challenged or contradicted or demanded anything I didn't want to give. And I was too much of a coward to admit that perfection like that doesn't come from contentment. It comes from survival. He walked to the window overlooking the palace grounds. Gardens his wife had designed, fountains she'd commissioned, paths she'd walked while planning her escape. She was surviving me, Cedric said quietly. For 3 years she was surviving being married to a man who took everything she gave and then resented her for not giving more. And I was too blind to see it until she stopped pretending. Selena stood in silence for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its warmth. So I was just a weapon. Something you used to hurt her without having to admit you wanted to. Maybe. Probably. Does it matter now? It matters to me. Then I'm sorry for that too. Cedric turned from the window. I'm sorry I used you. I'm sorry I destroyed my marriage with you as the instrument. I'm sorry I thought I could have everything without consequence. But mostly, I'm sorry that every apology I offer now is just me trying to feel less like the villain in a story where I definitely am. Selena left without another word. Cedric watched from the window as she crossed the palace courtyard toward the gates, her blue dress disappearing into the London crowds beyond. Another casualty of his spectacular miscalculation. Another person he'd hurt while convincing himself he was the one being wronged. The financial reports on his desk told stories in numbers. Investments withdrawn, credit lines frozen, business partnerships dissolving. The Ravenshire fortune, built over 6 generations of careful management and strategic marriages, hemorrhaging wealth like an artery cut open. His estate manager appeared with more bad news wrapped in careful language. Your Grace, the tenants at Thornfield are 3 months behind on rents and threatening to withhold payment entirely until the property disputes are resolved. What property disputes? They claim the Duchess had approved several infrastructure improvements before her departure, and they expect those commitments to be honored. Tell them the Duchess no longer has authority to approve anything. The estate manager shifted uncomfortably. Your Grace, legally speaking, several of those properties were part of her dowry arrangement. Her departure doesn't necessarily void her interest in their management. Cedric felt a headache building behind his eyes. Are you telling me my wife still has legal claim to portions of the estate? I'm telling you the marriage contracts were far more complex than perhaps previously understood. The Duchess's family lawyers were remarkably thorough in protecting her interests. Of course they were, because while Cedric had been focused on acquiring a beautiful wife with an impeccable pedigree, Evelyn's father had been protecting his daughter from exactly the kind of man Cedric turned out to be. What else? The Northern coal investments have been suspended pending review of the partnership agreements. Apparently several key investors were personal friends of the late Duke Ashcombe and are questioning whether to continue business relations given the treatment of his daughter. They're choosing her over me. They're choosing stability over scandal, Your Grace. And right now the Duchess represents stability while you represent risk. The truth of it hit like a fist. Evelyn had left him, yes, but she'd left him strategically, timing her departure for maximum impact, orchestrating public sympathy while she vanished to rebuild somewhere he couldn't touch her. She'd been 3 moves ahead the entire time. How long? Cedric asked quietly. Your Grace? How long has she been planning this? The estate manager considered the question carefully. Given the complexity of her current situation, the speed with which she established operations in Norhaven, the legal groundwork that was apparently already in place, I'd estimate at least 6 months, Your Grace. Possibly longer. 6 months. While Cedric had been sneaking off to see Selena and congratulating himself on maintaining his secret, Evelyn had been consulting lawyers, arranging finances, preparing her escape route down to the last detail. While he'd been playing games, she'd been planning war. Get out, Cedric said quietly. Your Grace, get out before I say something we'll both regret. The estate manager fled. Cedric sat alone in his study as afternoon died into evening, as servants moved quietly through distant corridors, as the palace settled into the kind of silence that came from a house where joy had abandoned the architecture. He thought about going to Norhaven. Imagined arriving at whatever hovel she'd chosen, demanding to see his wife, insisting on his rights as husband and father-to-be. Imagined the scene playing out a dozen different ways, none of them ending with Evelyn's return. Because she didn't want to return. That was the part that kept circling in his mind like a vulture waiting for death. She wasn't punishing him or teaching him a lesson or waiting for the right apology. She was done. Finished. Moving forward into a life that no longer included him except as a mistake she'd learned from. The child, though. Surely she wouldn't keep his heir from him. Except the child wasn't his heir anymore. Not legally. Not if Evelyn filed for formal separation. Not if she convinced the courts that Cedric was unfit, that his public behavior had demonstrated a fundamental lack of judgment and decency. His father's portrait hung over the fireplace, oil paint rendering the old Duke's perpetual disapproval with uncomfortable accuracy. 6 generations of Ravenshires staring down from canvas and frame, watching their legacy collapse under the weight of Cedric's arrogance. "I thought I was powerful," Cedric said to the empty room. "Thought I could have anything I wanted just by taking it. Thought she'd stay because leaving was harder than endurance." The portraits offered no comfort. 3 weeks after Eveline's departure, Cedric received a letter with a Norhaven postmark, not her handwriting, a lawyer's careful script. "Your Grace, on behalf of my client, the Duchess of Ravenshire, I am writing to inform you of her intention to pursue formal legal separation on grounds of abandonment of marital duties, public humiliation, and creation of an unsafe domestic environment. The Duchess wishes you to know that any attempt to contact her directly or interfere with her business operations will result in immediate escalation to the royal court. She requests that all future communication be conducted through legal representation. Enclosed, please find the preliminary documentation." Cedric read the letter 3 times, searching for some hint of emotion beneath the legal language, some crack in the facade suggesting Evelyn still cared enough to be hurt. He found nothing but professional efficiency. The documentation outlined her case with surgical precision. Witness testimony from servants who'd observed his absences and Selina's frequent presence. Financial records showing irregular expenses matching his secret townhouse payments. A timeline of his affair cross-referenced with public events where Evelyn had performed the role of devoted wife while he'd been planning his next escape. She'd documented everything, every slight, every absence, every lie. Built her case over 3 years while smiling for photographers and hosting dinner parties and playing the perfect Duchess. The woman he'd underestimated had been gathering evidence while he'd been congratulating himself on his discretion. The final page contained a single paragraph that hit harder than all the legal language combined. "My client wishes to make clear that she harbors no ill will toward the Duke, but rather profound disappointment that a marriage entered with hope became a situation requiring strategic escape. She wishes him well in his future endeavors and requests the dignity of distance as both parties move forward with their separate lives." No ill will, just disappointment. Like he was a failed investment rather than a husband who'd shattered her trust in front of everyone who mattered. That night, Cedric got drunk enough to stop thinking. Drank until the study stopped looking like a prison and started looking like exactly what it was, the future he'd chosen, stretching out in silence and isolation and consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. Somewhere on the coast, Evelyn was rebuilding her father's shipping business. Somewhere beyond his reach, she was pregnant with his child and planning a life that made her happy instead of just presentable. And Cedric was here, alone in a palace that felt like a mausoleum, holding power that meant nothing, and wealth that solved nothing, and a title that impressed no one anymore. He'd thought he was trading up when he chose Selina's uncomplicated affection over Evelyn's complex silence, but he'd been trading everything that mattered for everything that didn't. And now, with perfect clarity that came too late and changed nothing, Cedric understood exactly what he'd lost. Not just a wife, not just an heir, not just political stability or financial security or public respect. He'd lost the only person who'd ever seen him clearly and chosen to stay anyway, who'd spent 3 years trying to build something real from the ruins of their arranged marriage, while he'd been too busy resenting the effort to notice what she was offering. Evelyn had given him everything except the easy validation he'd craved. And he'd thrown it away for a woman who gave him nothing except the feeling of being wanted without actually having to be worth wanting. The whiskey bottle emptied, the candles burned down, the palace settled into darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, Cedric crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross, moved from denial into something worse, acceptance that couldn't change anything. She wasn't coming back. No apology would reach her, no gesture would undo what he'd done. No amount of regret would transform him into the husband she deserved 3 years ago. He'd had his chance at building something real. Had it for 3 years while she'd been patient and graceful and strong enough to hope he'd notice what he had. Instead, he'd noticed Selina and destroyed everything while convincing himself he was the one being brave enough to want more. Now he had more. More silence, more isolation, more time to understand exactly how a man could have everything and still choose to burn it down because he was too blind to recognize love when it came wrapped in dignity instead of desire. The legal separation would proceed. The scandal would age into history. Evelyn would build her empire on the coast while Cedric watched his crumble from the inside. And the worst part, the part that made drinking feel like breathing and silence feel like screaming, was knowing he deserved every single consequence heading his way. Because some mistakes don't get forgiven. They just get survived by the people smart enough to walk away before the wreckage falls. Evelyn had walked away. Cedric was still standing in the wreckage, finally understanding what it cost to mistake endurance for weakness and patience for permission. But understanding changed nothing, fixed nothing, saved nothing. It just made the silence hurt more. The whiskey stopped working after the first month. Cedric discovered that some pain couldn't be drowned, only postponed. And postponement had a compound interest that accumulated in the hours between midnight and dawn when the palace felt like a tomb built specifically for him. 6 weeks after Evelyn's departure, his world had contracted to the dimensions of his study. The rest of Blackthorn Palace existed in theoretical space, rooms he passed through without occupying, corridors that echoed with the absence of servants who'd found employment elsewhere. The staff had thinned from 43 to 11. The ones who remained moved through the building like ghosts haunting a shipwreck, performing duties for a house that had already sunk. His cousin arrived on a Tuesday morning without announcement, stepping into the study with the confidence of family who assumed their presence required no permission. Marcus Ravenshire looked prosperous in a way that felt aggressive. New tailoring, expensive watch chain, boots polished to a mirror shine. He settled into the chair across from Cedric's desk without invitation, crossing his legs with the ease of men who'd never questioned their welcome anywhere. "You look like hell, Cedric." Cedric didn't bother defending himself. The mirror had stopped lying weeks ago. Unshaven, rumpled shirt, eyes that belonged to someone 20 years older and considerably more defeated. "What do you want, Marcus?" "To help." His cousin's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Family helps family, especially during difficult times." "How generous. I mean it." Marcus leaned forward, all earnest concern and manufactured sympathy. "The estate is hemorrhaging money. Your political allies have scattered. Half the staff has abandoned ship. You need someone you can trust to help stabilize the situation before it becomes completely unsalvageable. And you're volunteering out of the goodness of your heart. I'm volunteering because watching the Ravenshire name collapse benefits no one in this family." Marcus pulled a leather portfolio from his bag, spreading documents across the desk. "I've been reviewing the financial reports. With some strategic restructuring and a few key decisions, we can stop the bleeding, but you need to act now before the creditors start circling." Cedric stared at the papers without reading them. Numbers and projections and columns that promised salvation if he just signed away a little more control, delegated a little more authority, trusted a little more in the family member who'd appeared exactly when desperation made men stupid. What kind of decisions? Consolidation. Sell off the peripheral properties, the ones losing money. Focus resources on the core holdings. Cut unnecessary expenses. Marcus's finger traced lines on a spreadsheet like a surgeon planning an operation. The Thornfield estates are costing more than they generate. The shipping investments your wife's father made are dead weight. We liquidate the non-performing assets and shore up what actually matters. Those shipping investments are legally complicated. Evelyn's dowry arrangements. "Your wife abandoned you," Marcus interrupted, his voice hardening just slightly. "She forfeited any consideration the moment she walked out. Her dowry protections don't mean anything if she's not here to claim them. The lawyers disagree. The lawyers are billing you by the hour to disagree." Marcus shuffled papers, producing a new document. "I've consulted with different counsel. More aggressive representation. They believe we can challenge the dowry arrangements on grounds of abandonment. Your wife left. She chose to dissolve the partnership. Why should she retain any financial interest in assets she's no longer helping to manage? Because the law says she can. Laws can be challenged." Marcus met his eyes directly. "Or you can sit here drinking yourself into irrelevance while she builds her little coastal empire with resources that should belong to the Ravenshire estate. Your choice." Cedric felt the trap closing, but couldn't see the mechanism clearly enough to avoid it. Marcus was right about the finances. The reports showed hemorrhaging that would become fatal within 6 months without intervention. And family meant something, didn't it? Blood and legacy and the shared interest in preserving what generations had built. "What do you need from me?" Signature authority. Marcus produced another document, this one dense with legal language. Temporary power of attorney for estate management, just until we stabilize the situation. You're clearly overwhelmed, Cedric. There's no shame in delegating to someone who can think clearly right now. The paper sat between them like a test. Cedric's hand moved toward the pen before his brain fully engaged with what he was signing. Something whispered warning in the back of his mind. Some instinct that had been drowned in whiskey and self-pity, but still recognized danger when it wore a familiar face. How long is temporary? 6 months, just long enough to implement the restructuring and get things back on stable ground. Marcus's smile looked almost genuine. Then you take back full control, and I fade into the background again. I don't want your position, Cedric. I just want to help preserve it. The pen felt heavy. Cedric signed his name in a hand that shook slightly, watching ink make permanent what desperation had made necessary. Marcus gathered the documents with the efficiency of men who'd gotten exactly what they came for. I'll start immediately. You should know the first step involves liquidating several properties, including the Thornfield holdings and the warehouse district near the docks. The warehouse district. Something clicked in Cedric's memory. Those warehouses bordered the shipping routes Evelyn's father had used. Wasn't there some connection there? Some detail he'd ignored when he was busy resenting her family's commercial background? Why those specifically? Because they're losing money, Marcus said simply. And because holding them makes no strategic sense unless you're planning to enter the shipping business yourself. Which I assume you're not. No. Cedric's head felt thick, thoughts moving through fog. No, I suppose not. Marcus left with the signed documents and a promise to report back within the week. The study door closed with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Cedric poured another drink and told himself he'd made the right choice. Family could be trusted. Blood meant loyalty. Marcus had no reason to betray him. The lies tasted like cheap whiskey and felt about as convincing. 3 days later, his remaining estate manager knocked on the study door with an expression that had moved beyond concern into something closer to panic. Your Grace, there's been a development. Cedric looked up from papers he'd been staring at without reading. What kind of development? Your cousin has begun liquidating assets at a pace that seems aggressive. Several properties have been sold already, well below market value. That's part of the restructuring plan. We discussed this. Your Grace, the buyers are shell companies I can't trace, and the funds from those sales haven't appeared in any Ravenshire estate accounts. The words took a moment to penetrate the fog that had become Cedric's default state. Say that again. The money is missing. The estate manager set down a folder thick with documentation. Multiple properties sold in the past 72 hours. Millions in assets converted to cash. None of it showing up in our ledgers. Cedric felt something cold and sharp cutting through the whiskey haze. Where's Marcus? I don't know, Your Grace. He hasn't been to the estate offices since yesterday afternoon. His townhouse staff says he left London last night. With how much of my money? All of it, sir. The estate manager's voice cracked slightly. Everything he could liquidate quickly. Everything the power of attorney gave him access to. He stripped the estate down to the foundation and disappeared with the proceeds. The room tilted. Cedric gripped the desk edge hard enough to hurt, watching his reality reorganize itself around a truth he should have seen coming from miles away. Marcus hadn't come to help. He'd come to finish what Evelyn's departure had started. Came to loot the carcass while Cedric was too drunk and broken to defend himself. Came wearing family loyalty like camouflage while planning betrayal down to the last detail. How bad? The estate manager looked like a man delivering a death sentence. Without immediate intervention, you'll lose everything within the month. The properties that haven't been sold yet are encumbered with debt Marcus arranged. The remaining assets are leveraged to the point of worthlessness. He's left you with the title and the palace and obligations you can't possibly meet. So I'm bankrupt. Not yet. But you will be unless you can recover the stolen funds or find alternative capital immediately. Cedric laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Alternative capital. From whom exactly? Every investor in London has already fled. Every political ally has discovered urgent business elsewhere. I'm toxic, remember? The Duke who humiliated his pregnant wife, the man who brought his mistress to a birthday party and destroyed his own marriage in front of 200 witnesses. Your Grace, get out. Sir, we need to discuss. Get out before I throw you out. The estate manager fled. Cedric sat in silence that felt like drowning, staring at papers that documented his complete destruction. Marcus had played him perfectly, waited until desperation made him stupid, until isolation made him vulnerable, then struck with surgical precision. Family. He'd trusted family while his wife had been the one planning 3 moves ahead. The irony tasted like blood. A knock on the door interrupted his spiral into self-loathing. His head of security, one of the few staff members who'd remained despite the cascading disaster. Your Grace, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent. Tell them I'm not receiving visitors. It's your wife, sir. The words hit like electricity through water. Cedric stood without conscious decision, his heart doing something complicated and painful in his chest. Evelyn. Here. After 6 weeks of silence and legal documents in complete absence, she was in the receiving room, standing near the windows overlooking gardens she'd once maintained. Pregnancy had changed her silhouette, made her movements more deliberate, but her face held the same unreadable composure that had frustrated him for 3 years. Then he saw what she was wearing. Not the soft colors of duchesses, but the severe blacks and grays of businesswomen who'd learned to dress like armor. Her hair pulled back severely. No jewelry except a simple watch. She looked like someone who'd walked out of the aristocracy entirely and decided she preferred the view from outside. Evelyn. Cedric. Her voice held neither warmth nor hostility, just the flat professionalism of people conducting unpleasant business. I heard about Marcus. News travels fast. News of a duke being robbed blind by his own cousin tends to travel very fast, yes. She turned from the window, her hand resting on her belly in a gesture he recognized from before. I came to make you an offer. An offer. You need capital. I have access to capital. She said it like stating weather conditions. My shipping business has become surprisingly profitable in the past 6 weeks. Turns out Father's old roots were underutilized rather than worthless. I've secured contracts with 3 major trading companies and expanded operations to include warehousing and distribution. The warehouse district, Cedric said slowly. The properties Marcus just sold. Were sold to my holding company? Yes. Through intermediaries, obviously. I didn't want there to be any question of legality. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. You knew. You knew Marcus would betray me. I suspected. Evelyn's expression didn't change. He's been sniffing around the Ravenshire finances for years, waiting for an opening. Your spectacular collapse gave him that opening. I simply positioned myself to benefit from his predictable greed, by buying my properties at below market value, by preventing him from selling them to actual strangers who might have done worse. Her eyes held something cold and calculating that he'd never seen before. Now I own the warehouse district, the docking rights, and the shipping routes, which means I control most of the commercial infrastructure you need to rebuild any kind of trade-based revenue. So you came here to gloat. I came here to negotiate. Evelyn crossed to the desk, produced her own documents. I'll sell the properties back to you at cost. No profit, no interest. You get the assets you need to survive. I get what I actually want, which is full custody of our child, legal separation with no contest, and your signature on documents acknowledging that I rebuilt these assets through my own effort and they remain my property regardless of marital status. Cedric felt like he was drowning in shallow water. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you survival in exchange for acknowledgement of reality. She said it like explaining mathematics to a child. You destroyed our marriage. Marcus destroyed your finances. I'm offering to undo Marcus's damage if you stop pretending our marriage can be undone. And if I refuse, then Marcus keeps the money, you lose everything within the month, and I raise our child knowing their father chose pride over their well-being. Evelyn's composure never cracked. Your choice, Cedric, same as it's always been. He stared at her, this woman he'd underestimated so completely that she'd managed to position herself as his only lifeline while he was busy drinking himself into oblivion. She'd known Marcus would strike, had anticipated it, had positioned her assets to catch Cedric when he fell, not to save him out of love, but to negotiate from a position of total control. Why? The word came out hoarse. Why save me at all? Because our child deserves a father who isn't completely destroyed. Evelyn's hand moved over her belly again, protective. Not because I forgive you, not because I want you back, but because raising a child who watches their father lose everything to preventable stupidity isn't the lesson I want to teach. So this is charity. This is pragmatism. She held out a pen. Sign the documents. Acknowledge the separation. Give me full custody. In exchange, you get the properties back and enough capital to rebuild something resembling stability. You'll never be what you were, but you won't be destitute. The pen sat between them like the earlier one Marcus had offered, but this time Cedric understood exactly what he was signing. Understood that Evelyn had outplayed both him and Marcus, had positioned herself as the only player left standing while the men who'd underestimated her destroyed each other. You planned all of this. I planned to survive, Evelyn corrected. The rest of you just made it easier by being exactly as predictable as I calculated. Cedric took the pen. His hand didn't shake this time. He signed his name to documents that formalized everything he'd already lost: his wife, his child, his illusions about power and control, and the loyalty of men who shared his blood. Evelyn gathered the papers with the same efficiency Marcus had shown, but without the false sympathy. The properties will transfer back within the week. I'll have my lawyers coordinate with yours. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Cedric, I don't hate you. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. I just finally understand what you are. She said it without cruelty, just observation. A man who mistakes wanting something for deserving it, who confuses power with competence, who thought 3 years of my silence meant consent instead of strategy. Evelyn, goodbye, Cedric. Take care of yourself. Our child might want to know you someday, and I'd prefer they meet someone who learned something from this disaster. She left. Cedric stood in the receiving room that had witnessed 1,000 aristocratic negotiations, staring at the space where his wife had stood and delivered his salvation wrapped in his complete defeat. She'd saved him, and in doing so, had demonstrated exactly how thoroughly she'd surpassed him. While he'd been drinking and wallowing and trusting the wrong people, Evelyn had been building an empire, had anticipated Marcus's betrayal, positioned herself to benefit from it, and used her advantage to extract exactly what she wanted while leaving Cedric just enough to survive on. Not out of love, out of calculated mercy that hurt worse than hatred ever could. The head of security appeared in the doorway. Your Grace, there's a reporter from the Times requesting comment on the recent financial developments. Tell them no comment. Sir, they're going to publish with or without your input. The rumor is that Marcus Ravenshire has fled the country with millions in stolen assets, and you're facing complete financial ruin. Then let them publish the truth. Cedric's voice came out flat and exhausted. I have nothing left to protect. But the Ravenshire name is attached to a duke who publicly humiliated his wife, lost his fortune to his own cousin, and had to be rescued by the woman he betrayed. Cedric met the man's eyes. There's no version of this story that makes me look competent. We might as well be honest about it. The security chief left. Cedric walked through the palace that felt like a museum dedicated to his failures, past the ballroom where he'd destroyed his marriage, past Evelyn's empty chambers, past rooms that had once represented power and now just represented space he couldn't afford to heat. He ended up in his father's old study, standing before the portrait that had witnessed 6 generations of Ravenshire competence. The painted eyes looked down with the same disappointment they'd held in life. I lost everything, Cedric said to the portrait. Wife, fortune, respect, the loyalty of my own blood. Everything you built, everything you trusted me to preserve. The portrait offered no absolution. And the worst part is that the woman I betrayed is the one who saved me from complete destruction. She planned better, thought further ahead, positioned herself strategically while I was busy feeling sorry for myself. She became everything I thought I was and never actually achieved. The silence in the study felt like judgment. Cedric sank into his father's old chair, the leather cracked from decades of use. Outside, London continued without him. Inside, the palace that had represented unquestionable power revealed itself as just architecture that couldn't protect stupid men from their own decisions. Marcus had taken his money. Evelyn had taken his pride. And Cedric was left with the title that meant nothing, and the understanding that came too late to change anything. He'd thought power meant never having to choose, never having to sacrifice, never having to admit weakness or limitation or the basic human need for partnership instead of performance. Instead, he'd learned that real power belonged to people like Evelyn, who planned in silence, who turned underestimation into advantage, who walked away from situations that would destroy them and rebuilt from nothing, while the men who'd hurt them collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. The documents Evelyn had left sat on the desk: legal separation, custody arrangements, property transfers, the formal architecture of his complete defeat rendered in precise legal language. But also survival, barely, just enough to rebuild something smaller and more honest than the empire he'd inherited and destroyed. The choice, Evelyn had said, same as it's always been. Except now Cedric finally understood what the choice actually was. Not between wife and mistress, duty and desire, public and private, but between the comfortable lies that destroyed slowly and the harsh truths that built painfully. He'd chosen lies for 3 years, had chosen them again when Marcus offered easy salvation, and both times the lies had cost him everything that mattered. Now, sitting in ruins of his own making, Cedric faced the choice Evelyn had been giving him all along: stay broken and bitter, clinging to resentment about how unfair it all was, or accept that he'd been given one last chance to become something other than the man who'd thrown away gold while reaching for smoke. The palace settled into evening silence. Cedric sat in his father's chair beneath portraits of men who'd never faced this particular humiliation, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down like atmosphere before a storm. Everything had changed. Everything he'd been was gone. The question wasn't whether he'd been destroyed. It was whether he'd let that destruction be the end of his story or the beginning of actually learning what strength looked like when stripped of all the comfortable illusions. Evelyn had already answered that question for herself, had walked out of a burning building and built something better from the ashes. Now Cedric stood at the same threshold she'd crossed 6 weeks ago, finally understanding what it cost to change and what it cost to stay the same. And for the first time in his life, without money or power or family to hide behind, he had to decide which cost he was actually willing to pay. The decision came at 3 a.m. when Cedric stopped pretending sleep was possible and started planning like a man with nothing left to lose. 6 months. That's how long it took for the palace to finish dying around him. 6 months of watching servants disappear one by one until only 3 remained. 6 months of creditors circling like sharks drawn to blood in water. 6 months of living in a building designed for 50 staff with barely enough bodies to keep 2 wings habitable. But 6 months also taught him something Evelyn had apparently learned years ago: that survival wasn't about maintaining appearances. It was about shedding every comfortable lie until only the brutal core remained. Cedric stood in his study at dawn, freshly shaved for the first time in weeks, wearing clothes that fit properly instead of hanging like burial shrouds on his diminished frame. The whiskey bottles were gone. The self-pity had been surgically removed somewhere between midnight and morning. What remained was something colder and considerably more dangerous. The documents Evelyn had left sat on his desk beside new papers his lawyers had prepared: property deeds, asset inventories, a list of names that made his remaining staff nervous when they saw it. His estate manager knocked at precisely 6 o'clock, looking surprised to find Cedric not only awake but functioning. "Your Grace, I have the information you requested." "All of it?" The manager set down a folder thick enough to represent weeks of investigation. "Everything we could find on your cousin's movements: bank transfers, property purchases, travel records. He's been in Edinburgh for the past month, living quite comfortably under an assumed name." "Comfortable on my money?" "Yes, Your Grace." The manager hesitated. "Your Grace, what exactly are you planning?" "To take back what's mine." Cedric opened the folder, scanning documents that outlined Marcus's complete betrayal in methodical detail. Every property sold, every asset liquidated, every pound sterling stolen and laundered through shell companies designed to make recovery impossible. Except nothing was actually impossible, just expensive. And Cedric had learned that when you stopped caring about cost, remarkable things became achievable. "Arrange a meeting with the Northcroft Group." "Your Grace, the Northcroft Group are corporate raiders. They specialize in hostile acquisitions and asset stripping." Exactly. Cedric looked up from the documents. "Marcus thinks he's safe because he buried the money in legitimate businesses. Real estate holdings, shipping investments, manufacturing partnerships, all legal, all clean, all designed to look like shrewd business rather than theft. But if someone acquired those businesses, they'd acquire the stolen assets along with them. Cedric felt something like a smile trying to form, though it came out more like a predator baring teeth. Marcus built himself a comfortable prison. I'm just going to make sure the walls close in. The estate manager looked genuinely disturbed. Your Grace, that kind of campaign would be expensive. Viciously expensive. You'd need capital you don't have. I have what Eveline gave me. The properties she returned, the shipping routes, the warehouse district, those are your only remaining assets. If you leverage them and the campaign fails, then I'll have nothing. Cedric met his manager's eyes. Same as I'd have if I do nothing and let creditors strip the bones anyway. At least this way, I choose how I burn. There was a long silence. Then the manager nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a contract signed in blood. I'll arrange the meeting. The Northcroft Group operated from offices that looked like a bank designed by people who'd grown bored with subtlety. All steel and glass and the aggressive modernism of new money that didn't give a damn about aristocratic sensibilities. Cedric sat across from Harrison Northcroft himself, a man who'd built an empire by purchasing failing businesses and either resurrecting them or scavenging their corpses for profit. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd never lost sleep over which category any particular acquisition fell into. Your Grace. Northcroft didn't bother with false deference. I'm told you have a business proposition. I want to destroy my cousin financially. Cedric laid it out with the bluntness of men who'd stopped caring about social niceties. He stole from me. He's currently living on those stolen assets, thinking he's untouchable because the money's been laundered through legitimate enterprises. I want you to acquire those enterprises and crush them. Northcroft leaned back, fingers steepled, expression calculating. That's not a business proposition. That's revenge with a price tag. Call it what you want. Can you do it? Of course. Northcroft pulled documents from a drawer already prepared because men like him always did their homework before meetings. I've been watching your cousin's investments. Sloppy work, overextended, vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. But hostile acquisition campaigns aren't cheap, Your Grace, especially when the target will fight back. How much? Everything you have left. Northcroft slid a paper across the desk. Your warehouse district, your shipping routes, your remaining properties. All of it signed over as collateral. We run the campaign. If we succeed in acquiring your cousin's assets, you get them back minus our standard fee. If we fail, we keep everything and you walk away with nothing. And Marcus? If we succeed, he loses everything. His investments get absorbed into our portfolio. His properties get liquidated. His comfortable Edinburgh life evaporates. He'll be exactly where you are now, except without the title or the chance to rebuild. Cedric looked at the contract that would gamble his last remaining assets on a revenge campaign that might fail spectacularly. Looked at the man across the desk who had no loyalty to aristocratic honor or family mercy. Looked at the future stretching ahead where he either reclaimed something resembling power or lost absolutely everything in the attempt. The old Cedric would have hesitated, would have consulted advisors and weighed options and tried to find a safer path that preserved some dignity. But the old Cedric had died 6 months ago in a ballroom while his wife walked out and his world imploded. Where do I sign? Northcroft smiled like a wolf invited to shepherd sheep. Excellent decision, Your Grace. We'll begin immediately. The campaign unfolded over 3 months with the brutal efficiency of predators hunting wounded prey. Northcroft's people moved first on Marcus's real estate holdings, identified over-leveraged properties, found technical violations in zoning compliance, applied pressure through shell companies that Marcus never connected back to Cedric until it was too late. The first property fell in week 2, a commercial building in Manchester that Marcus had purchased with stolen funds, now acquired by Northcroft at 10% below market value after sudden discovery of foundation issues that required immediate remediation. Marcus probably didn't even notice. One property among dozens. A small loss in a portfolio that seemed secure. But small losses accumulated. Week 3 brought 2 more acquisitions. Week 4, 3. By week 6, Marcus's comfortable Edinburgh life started showing cracks. Cedric monitored progress from Blackthorn Palace like a general watching troop movements on a map. Each property acquired, each asset absorbed, each step closer to draining the stolen fortune that had financed his cousin's betrayal. His remaining staff watched him with something between fear and fascination. The broken duke, drinking himself into oblivion, had transformed into something harder and considerably more frightening. Cedric ate meals at regular intervals now, slept in controlled bursts, spent 18 hours a day coordinating with Northcroft's team, identifying vulnerabilities, exploiting weaknesses in Marcus's hastily constructed empire. Turned out that pain, when properly refined, made excellent fuel. Your Grace, his estate manager appeared with news that made the past 3 months worth every sleepless night. We've located the primary account, the one where your cousin stored the bulk of the liquid assets. How much? 4.7 million. The manager's voice held something like awe. Sitting in an Edinburgh bank under a shell corporation that exists solely to hold the funds, Northcroft believes we can force liquidation if we acquire the holding company. What's required? Everything we haven't already spent, every remaining pound of the collateral you posted. Northcroft says if we want the account, this is the moment. But if we commit and fail, we're done. Cedric finished the sentence. Completely bankrupt. No assets, no options, nothing left to leverage. Yes, Your Grace. Cedric looked out the window at gardens that had gone wild without staff to maintain them, looked at the palace that represented 6 generations of careful accumulation now reduced to a gamble on a single play. Evelyn would have calculated the odds, would have risk assessed and contingency planned, and made sure she had 17 exits before committing to this kind of move. But Cedric wasn't Evelyn, never had been, never would be. What he was, stripped of everything comfortable and familiar, was a man who'd learned that sometimes the only move left was the one that risked total destruction. Do it. The manager nodded and disappeared. Cedric stood alone in his study, feeling the weight of the decision settling like stones in his chest. In 72 hours, he'd either reclaim his stolen fortune or lose everything in a failure so complete that bankruptcy would seem gentle. There was a certain freedom in that, a clarity that came from having absolutely nothing left to protect except the possibility of not dying on his knees. The call came at midnight 3 days later. Cedric was still awake, as he'd been for the past 60 hours. Sleep felt like luxury he couldn't afford until the outcome was decided. He picked up the telephone on the first ring. Northcroft's voice came through with the satisfaction of men who'd won exactly as planned. We have it, Your Grace, the holding company, the Edinburgh accounts. Everything your cousin stole. It's ours. The relief should have felt bigger. Instead, Cedric just felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. And Marcus? Broke. Furious, currently being escorted from his Edinburgh townhouse by creditors who discovered his rent was 6 months overdue. Northcroft's tone suggested he was enjoying this. He'll survive. But he'll survive poor, disgraced, and unemployable. Everything he built with your money is now ours to liquidate. Good. The word came out flat. Begin asset recovery. I want inventory within the week. There's one complication, Your Grace. Cedric felt tension returning to muscles that had just started to relax. What kind of complication? Your cousin didn't go quietly. Before we could freeze all his accounts, he transferred a significant sum. Just over £1 million. Moved it this morning to an account we can't touch. To who? We're still tracing it. But Your Grace, the transfer was made to an entity in Norhaven, which means Evelyn. Cedric felt something cold sliding down his spine. He sent my money to my wife. We don't know if she accepted it. But yes, that's where the transfer was directed. Cedric hung up without responding, stood in his study at midnight staring at nothing while implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling. Marcus had sent money to Evelyn, not as gift, as a weapon. One last play to damage Cedric even in defeat. Because if Evelyn accepted those funds, if she took £1 million of assets that legally belonged to the Ravenshire estate, it would give Cedric grounds to challenge their separation agreement, would create legal complications that could drag on for years, would force them back into contact, back into conflict, back into the toxic dynamic Marcus knew would destroy whatever fragile peace they'd constructed. The bastard was burning the bridge behind him, making sure that even if Cedric won, he'd lose something that mattered. Unless Eveline refused the money. Unless she was smart enough to see the trap and disciplined enough to reject a fortune that could expand her coastal empire considerably. Cedric grabbed his coat. His remaining staff looked startled when he appeared in the entrance hall demanding a carriage. "Your Grace, it's past midnight. Where—" "Norhaven." Cedric's voice came out harsh with urgency. "I need to reach Norhaven before morning. That's a 6-hour journey, Your Grace. Perhaps in the morning—" "Now!" The word cracked like a whip. Every hour I delay is an hour for that money to embed itself in her accounts. Every minute wasted is a minute closer to legal catastrophe. The staff scrambled to prepare a carriage. Cedric paced the entrance hall like a caged animal, feeling control slipping away just when he'd fought so hard to reclaim it. He'd destroyed Marcus, had taken back everything stolen, had won the war his cousin started. But victory meant nothing if Marcus's final play succeeded in reopening wounds that had barely started healing. The carriage rolled through London streets before dawn touched the horizon. Cedric sat in darkness, watching the city pass, preparing arguments he'd need to make when he reached the coast. Eveline had to refuse the money, had to see it for the trap it was, had to choose protecting their fragile separation over accepting resources that would drag them back into conflict. But wanting her to choose wisely didn't mean she would. 6 months ago, Eveline had demonstrated exactly how much Cedric didn't understand about her thinking, how many moves ahead she planned, how completely she'd outmaneuvered everyone underestimating her. What if Marcus had found the one angle she hadn't anticipated? The one offer she couldn't refuse? £1 million could double her shipping empire, could establish her as a serious commercial power instead of just a duchess playing at business, could secure her child's future in ways that didn't depend on Cedric's questionable stability. Why would she refuse that for the sake of protecting a man who'd publicly humiliated her? The carriage wheels 8 miles. Dawn broke over the countryside. Cedric watched morning light spread across fields while anxiety built in his chest like pressure before an explosion. He'd spent 3 months destroying his cousin, had gambled everything on revenge and won, had reclaimed assets and dignity and some measure of control over his shattered life. Now, racing toward the coast to beg his estranged wife to refuse a fortune, Cedric understood with brutal clarity that some battles couldn't be won with money or strategy or carefully orchestrated campaigns. Some battles required trusting the person you'd betrayed to choose mercy over advantage. And trust, once destroyed as completely as he'd destroyed Eveline's, didn't rebuild just because you suddenly needed it. The coastal road appeared as the sun climbed toward noon. Cedric could smell salt air through the carriage windows, could see Norhaven's harbor in the distance, could feel his heart doing something complicated and painful in response to proximity to the woman who'd saved him once and might destroy him now. Not out of malice, just out of perfectly reasonable self-interest that happened to conflict with his desperate need for her to choose his well-being over her own advantage. The carriage pulled up to a building that hadn't existed 6 months ago. New construction, fresh paint, a sign declaring Ashcombe shipping and trade in letters designed to command respect rather than invite it. Eveline had built this. From nothing. While Cedric had been drinking and Marcus had been stealing, and the entire aristocracy had been watching and judging. She'd built an empire while he'd been losing his. Cedric climbed from the carriage, his legs stiff from 6 hours of travel, his mind sharp with desperation that made everything feel too bright and too real. The office door opened before he could knock. Eveline stood in the doorway, 8 months pregnant now, her belly prominent beneath the severe business clothes she'd adopted like armor. Her expression held no surprise, no warmth, no hostility, just the terrible neutrality of someone who'd been expecting exactly this visit. Cedric. Her voice carried the same flat professionalism it had 6 months ago. I wondered how long it would take you to get here. Marcus sent you money. I know. She stepped aside, allowing him entry. I received notification this morning. Quite a substantial transfer. The office interior looked like efficiency distilled to architecture. Clean lines, organized files, a massive map of shipping routes covering one wall. Everything designed for function over form by someone who'd stopped caring about impressing anyone. You can't accept it. Can't? Eveline's eyebrow raised slightly. That's an interesting word choice. If you take that money, it gives me legal grounds to challenge our separation. Marcus knows that. He's trying to force us back into conflict even as he loses everything else. And you rushed here to warn me out of the goodness of your heart. I rushed here to prevent another disaster." Cedric felt frustration building. "To stop Marcus from destroying what we've carefully constructed." "What we've constructed," Evelyn repeated slowly, "is nothing. We've constructed absence, distance, legal boundaries that allow us both to move forward separately." "There's no we anymore, Cedric. That ended in a ballroom 6 months ago. Then don't give him the opportunity to drag us back. Refuse the transfer. Send it back. Remove the weapon before he can use it." Evelyn moved to the window overlooking the harbor. Ships moved in the distance. Her ships. Her roots. Her empire built from ruins while Cedric had been fighting his own battles. "£1 million would allow me to expand into 3 new trade routes," she said quietly. "Would let me purchase my own fleet instead of leasing vessels. Would establish my son's future security in ways that don't depend on aristocratic mercy or your eventual financial recovery. So you're going to take it. I'm going to consider it." She turned from the window, her hand resting on her belly. "Because unlike you, I don't make decisions based on panic or pride or what feels immediately necessary. I make them based on calculated assessment of long-term consequences. The calculated assessment here is obvious." Cedric heard his voice rising. "Marcus is setting a trap. You're smart enough to see it. I'm smart enough to see several things you're missing." Evelyn's composure never cracked. "I see £1 million that could change my child's life. I see a man who destroyed our marriage now demanding I protect him from consequences of his own family's betrayal. I see you expecting me to choose your well-being over my own advantage for the second time in 6 months, as if the first rescue earned you unlimited future clemency. I'm not asking for clemency. I'm asking you not to let Marcus win. Marcus already lost. You saw to that." Her eyes held something cold and appraising. "This isn't about him winning. It's about whether I should refuse a fortune to protect a man who gave me 6 months of peace by staying away. And you showing up here, making demands, disrupting that peace, suggests that maybe protecting you isn't actually in my best interest." The words hit like physical blows. Cedric felt the ground shifting beneath him, felt the conversation moving in directions he couldn't control. "Evelyn, please, don't." She held up one hand. "Don't beg. Don't plead. Don't reduce yourself like that. You came here to make your case. You've made it. Now leave and let me decide without your presence turning this into emotional manipulation. This isn't manipulation. This is me asking the mother of my child not to blow up our separation for money. Everything is manipulation, Cedric. Every request, every plea, every time you show up expecting me to save you from consequences while offering nothing in return." Her voice remained calm, but something underneath had gone cold as deep ocean water. "You want me to refuse a fortune? Fine. What are you offering in exchange?" "Exchange? You're asking me to sacrifice £1 million worth of expansion capital. What are you offering that makes that sacrifice worthwhile?" Cedric opened his mouth and realized he had no answer. Nothing he could offer matched what she'd be refusing. No promise meant anything from a man who'd broken the biggest one already. "I thought so." Evelyn moved toward the door, dismissing him like a failed business proposal. "Go home, Cedric. Let me make this decision without your desperation clouding my judgment. If you accept that money, then we'll deal with the legal complications. Or we won't. Either way, it's my choice to make." She opened the door. "Goodbye, Cedric." Again. "Wait. No." Her expression held finality. "No more waiting, no more dramatic appearances, no more expecting me to choose your stability over my child's future. You spent 3 years taking everything I offered and resenting me for not offering more. I'm done being the woman who sacrifices her interests to protect yours." Cedric stood in the doorway, feeling helpless in a way that had nothing to do with money or property or any resource he could leverage. "Please," he said quietly. "I know I have no right to ask. I know you owe me nothing, but please don't let him turn this into another war." Evelyn met his eyes for a long moment. Something passed across her face too quickly to identify. Then her expression settled back into unreadable composure. "I'll make my decision by tomorrow." She said it like closing a business negotiation. "You'll know my choice when my lawyers contact yours. Until then, go home and stop acting like your presence changes anything." The door closed. Cedric stood outside the office that his wife had built, feeling the sun on his face and salt air in his lungs, and the terrible understanding that some things couldn't be controlled or manipulated or fought for with strategy and resources. Some things just required trusting that the person you'd destroyed might choose mercy anyway. And trust, Cedric had learned too late and too completely, was exactly what he'd spent 3 years teaching Evelyn never to give him. The carriage waited. London waited. The empire he'd barely salvaged from Marcus's betrayal waited. But here on the Norhaven coast, standing outside an office built from the ruins of his marriage, Cedric could only wait and hope and pray to forces he didn't believe in that Evelyn would choose to protect him one more time. Not because he deserved it, but because she was better than Marcus. Better than Cedric. Better than all the men who'd underestimated her and paid for it in ways they never saw coming. Tomorrow would bring her decision. Tonight would be 6 hours of carriage ride back to London, wondering if he'd won the war against Marcus only to lose everything to his wife's perfectly justified choice to finally put herself first. The carriage ride back to London felt like traveling through a country that no longer existed. Cedric watched the coastal roads give way to farmland, then villages, then the smoke-stained sprawl of the capital, and felt each mile adding weight to the silence inside his chest. 24 hours. That's how long Evelyn had given him before her decision would arrive through lawyers speaking in the careful language of contracts and consequences. 24 hours to sit in the ruins of Blackthorn Palace and understand that some outcomes couldn't be controlled no matter how much strategy a man applied. He'd fought Marcus with everything he had left, had gambled his last assets on revenge and won, had reclaimed stolen property and destroyed his cousin's comfortable exile with the cold efficiency of men who'd learned that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who could afford it. But winning that war meant nothing if Evelyn chose to accept Marcus's final weapon. If she took that £1 million and dragged them both back into legal conflict that would consume whatever fragile peace they'd built from the wreckage of their marriage. The decision was hers, entirely hers. And Cedric, stripped of power and leverage and every tool he'd once used to bend situations to his will, could do nothing but wait. Turned out that waiting was harder than fighting. Fighting gave you something to attack, some enemy to focus rage against. Waiting just gave you time to understand how completely you'd destroyed the trust of the only person whose choice actually mattered. Blackthorn Palace appeared in the distance as sunset painted the sky in colors that looked like bruises. The building seemed smaller than Cedric remembered, less imposing, just architecture that had survived 6 generations and might not survive the 7th. His remaining staff met him in the entrance hall with expressions that suggested they'd been preparing for the worst while hoping for something slightly less catastrophic. "Your Grace, any news from Norhaven?" "Not yet." Cedric stripped off his travel coat, feeling exhaustion in bones that had nothing to do with 6 hours in a carriage. "Tomorrow morning. That's when we'll know. And if the Duchess accepts the money, then we prepare for legal complications that will make the past 6 months look simple." Cedric moved toward his study, then stopped. "Actually, if the Duchess accepts the money, start looking for new positions, because we won't be able to afford staff much longer." The servants exchanged glances but said nothing. They'd been with him long enough to recognize when their duke had moved beyond reassurance into the brutal honesty of men who'd stopped pretending things might work out fine. Cedric spent the evening in his father's old study, surrounded by portraits of Ravenshire dukes who'd never faced this particular humiliation. Men who'd maintained their empires through careful marriages and strategic alliances, and the basic competence of not publicly destroying their wives in front of 200 witnesses. His father's painted eyes seemed particularly judgmental tonight. 6 generations of accumulated wisdom and careful stewardship, all shattered by a son who'd confused power with invincibility and patience with permission. "I know," Cedric said to the portrait. "I failed spectacularly. Destroyed everything you built. Became exactly the kind of duke whose portrait future generations will use as a cautionary tale about arrogance and stupidity. The paint offered no absolution. But I won against Marcus. That has to count for something, except it didn't. Not really. Destroying his cousin had been necessary, but not redemptive. Had been justice, but not growth. Had been revenge executed with precision, but not wisdom gained through suffering. The real test was happening 100 miles away in a coastal office where Evelyn sat with Marcus's blood money and a choice that would define both their futures. Cedric poured a drink, then set it down untouched. Whiskey had been his refuge for 6 months, the thing he reached for when reality became unbearable. But tonight, with everything balanced on Eveline's decision, drinking felt like cowardice he could no longer afford. Some pain demanded to be felt clearly. Some waiting required full consciousness, even when consciousness hurt like breathing broken glass. He sat in darkness as the palace settled into night sounds, distant creaking of old wood, wind through empty corridors, the particular silence of buildings designed for crowds but occupied by ghosts. Somewhere in that silence, Cedric felt something shifting in his chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too bright a word for what he felt. More like acceptance that whatever happened tomorrow, he'd survive it the way Evelyn had survived him. She'd walked out of a burning marriage and built something better from ashes, had faced public humiliation and transformed it into public sympathy, had turned his betrayal into her liberation. If she chose to accept Marcus's money tomorrow, if she prioritized her empire over protecting Cedric's fragile recovery, she'd be doing exactly what he'd taught her to do, choosing her own interests over a relationship that had already failed. And he'd have no one to blame but the man staring back from every reflective surface in the palace, the man who'd had 3 years to build something real and had chosen comfortable lies instead. The man who'd finally learned what strength looked like only after losing everything that had made him feel strong. Dawn came slowly, bleeding light across London's rooftops like a wound that wouldn't close. Cedric had been awake to watch it, standing at the study window where Evelyn used to stand when she thought he wasn't watching, back when this palace had been her prison and he'd been too blind to see the bars. The morning post arrived at 8. His secretary brought the bundle with hands that shook slightly, understanding that somewhere in that stack of correspondence might be the letter that determined whether his duke had a future or just a title attached to bankruptcy. Cedric sorted through business letters and creditor notices and advertisements for services he could no longer afford. Nothing from Norhaven. Nothing from Evelyn's lawyers. Nothing but the ordinary catastrophe of running an empire on fumes and prayers. Maybe she'd changed her mind about the timeline. Maybe the decision required more consideration than 24 hours allowed. Maybe the knock on the study door interrupted speculation that was rapidly becoming desperation. "Your Grace, there's a visitor. A woman from Norhaven. Evelyn." Cedric felt his heart doing something complicated. She came herself instead of sending lawyers. "Not the Duchess, Your Grace. A representative from Ashcombe Shipping. She says she has documents requiring your immediate attention. Send her in." The woman who entered looked like efficiency distilled into human form. Severe business clothes, leather portfolio, expression that suggested she'd delivered difficult news before, and wasn't intimidated by ducal titles or palace architecture. "Your Grace." She set the portfolio on his desk without ceremony. "I'm Catherine Wells, Chief Financial Officer for Ashcombe Shipping and Trade. The Duchess asked me to deliver these personally and ensure you understood the terms clearly." Cedric felt his stomach dropping toward his feet. Here it was, the decision wrapped in legal language and delivered by a professional who could maintain composure when Evelyn herself might show something too human. "What terms?" "Miss." Wells opened the portfolio, extracting documents that looked dense with clauses and conditions. "The Duchess has declined the transfer from Marcus Ravenshire. All funds have been returned to the account of origin with instructions that any future contact from your cousin should be directed through legal channels prepared to prosecute fraud charges." The words took a moment to penetrate. Cedric stared at the woman across his desk, trying to reconcile what he'd heard with what he'd been bracing for. She refused the money. Completely. Ms. Wells's expression remained professionally neutral. "Furthermore, the Duchess has instructed me to inform you that she considers this matter closed. No legal complications, no challenges to your separation agreement, no further communication required." Relief hit like a wave, followed immediately by something more complicated. Evelyn had saved him again, had chosen protecting their fragile peace over expanding her empire, had looked at £1 million and decided Cedric's stability mattered more than her advantage. Why? The question came out hoarse. Ms. Wells regarded him with something that might have been sympathy beneath the professional veneer. "The Duchess didn't confide her reasoning to me, Your Grace, but she did ask me to convey a message." Cedric waited, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. She said to tell you this is the last time. She's protected you twice now from consequences of your own choices and the malice of your family. There won't be a third rescue. Whatever happens after today, you face alone." The words landed with the weight of doors closing permanently. Ms. Wells gathered her portfolio, preparing to leave. "Wait." Cedric stood, feeling desperation clawing up his throat. "I need to see her. Need to thank her properly." The Duchess was quite specific on this point. Miss Wells's voice held finality. "She doesn't wish to see you, hear from you, or receive communication of any kind. You have your separation. You have your recovered assets. You have your life back to the extent that Marcus's theft allowed. That's all the contact she's willing to maintain. Just 5 minutes. Please. Your Grace, I've delivered the message I was asked to deliver. Continuing this conversation would violate my instructions." Miss Wells moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, the Duchess didn't seem angry when she made these arrangements. Just tired. Very, very tired. The door closed. Cedric stood alone in his study, holding documents that proved Evelyn's mercy while simultaneously reinforcing her absolute unwillingness to maintain any connection beyond legal necessity. She'd saved him, and in doing so, had made it abundantly clear that her kindness came with permanent distance attached. No more rescues. No more interventions. No more Evelyn appearing in moments of crisis to prevent his complete destruction. Just separation, clean and final, with the understanding that whatever Cedric built from here, he built alone. The rest of that day passed in strange suspension. Cedric moved through the palace, making decisions that had been postponed during months of crisis. Hiring new staff, approving maintenance on wings that had fallen into disrepair, reviewing financial reports that, for the first time in 6 months, showed something other than cascading disaster. The assets recovered from Marcus, combined with Evelyn's refusal of the blood money, meant survival. Not prosperity, not the empire his father had left him, but enough to rebuild something smaller and more honest than what had been destroyed. His estate manager appeared late afternoon with a question that had apparently been building for months. "Your Grace, what do you want to do about the ballroom?" "What about it?" "It's been closed since that night. The staff have been asking whether we should reopen it, begin using it again for entertaining." Cedric walked to the ballroom for the first time in 6 months. The doors opened on a space that looked like a museum exhibit of his worst night. Chairs still arranged from that birthday party, tables waiting for guests who'd never return. Even the birthday cake, long since desiccated to dust, remained where Evelyn had placed her wedding ring. The ring was gone. Someone had taken it, or perhaps Evelyn herself had retrieved it during one of the legal meetings he'd been too drunk to attend properly. But the cake remained like a monument to destroyed marriages and spectacular failures of judgment. "Your Grace?" "Leave it closed." Cedric's voice came out quiet. "Permanently. That room died 6 months ago. No point pretending resurrection is possible. Should we clear it out? Remove the furniture? No, leave everything exactly as it is. Let it be a reminder of what happens when a man mistakes his wife's grace for weakness and her silence for surrender." The estate manager nodded and retreated. Cedric stood in the ballroom doorway, remembering Evelyn's face when he'd brought Selena onto the dance floor, remembering her perfect smile that had hidden complete devastation, remembering the exact moment she'd decided to leave him, watching it happen in real time, while being too arrogant to understand what he was witnessing. Some rooms were meant to stay closed. Some mistakes were too large to clean up with furniture arrangements and fresh paint. Days became weeks. Cedric rebuilt his life in dimensions smaller than before, but more sustainable. Hired competent staff who worked for fair wages instead of prestige. Reduced the palace operation to what could actually be maintained without phantom wealth or leveraged futures. Learned to live within means that would have seemed laughably modest 6 months ago, but felt like luxury compared to bankruptcy. He stopped drinking entirely. Found that sobriety, while painful, at least had the virtue of forcing him to face consequences clearly, instead of viewing them through the comfortable fog of expensive whiskey. His cousin Marcus reappeared in London after 3 months, looking like someone who'd aged a decade and half a year. Cedric encountered him by accident in a financial district cafe, both of them there for meetings with lawyers about debts and obligations and the dreary arithmetic of reduced circumstances. Marcus looked up from his coffee, saw Cedric, and something like resignation crossed his face. Cousin. Marcus. They stood in awkward silence, two men who'd destroyed each other over money that neither of them had managed to keep. I hear you recovered most of what I took, Marcus said finally. Most. Not all. More than I kept. Marcus's laugh sounded broken. Turns out that when you burn bridges on your way out, you find yourself stranded on an island with no infrastructure and considerable debt. Good. Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose I deserve that. You deserve worse. But Cedric found he didn't have the energy for extended hatred. You stole from family, betrayed trust, tried to destroy me on your way down. I know. Marcus met his eyes. I saw you drowning and decided to make sure you went under. Saw opportunity in your disaster and took it without hesitation. And I lost everything anyway because Eveline was smarter than both of us. She usually is. They stood in continued silence. Finally, Marcus gathered his papers, preparing to leave. For what it's worth, Cedric, I am sorry. Not sorry enough to make amends or seek forgiveness. But sorry in the way you are when you realize you destroyed something that might have been rebuilt if you just had the patience to wait. We're family, Cedric said quietly. We should have been allies instead of predators. Should have been. Marcus turned toward the door, then stopped. She really refused the money? All of it? All of it. Why? Cedric had spent weeks asking himself the same question, had reviewed every possible motivation, every strategic angle, every calculation that might explain why Eveline had chosen his stability over her expansion. He'd come to only one conclusion that fit the pattern. Because she's better than we are. Better than me for destroying our marriage. Better than you for trying to profit from that destruction. She could have taken advantage and didn't, because her definition of strength doesn't require other people's pain to prove itself. Marcus absorbed this with the expression of men realizing exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. We underestimated her. Everyone did. Cedric felt something like a smile trying to form. Probably still are. Right now, she's building an empire on the coast, while we're both standing in a cafe discussing debts with lawyers who charge by the 15-minute increment. Marcus left without further conversation. Cedric watched him disappear into London crowds, another casualty of miscalculated ambition and the fundamental misunderstanding that took Eveline's patience for weakness. The city moved around him, business conducted, lives lived. The ordinary catastrophe of London continuing whether Duke succeeded or failed or learned difficult lessons about the difference between power and strength. Winter arrived early that year, turning Blackthorn Palace into something beautiful and cold and slightly melancholic. Cedric walked the grounds alone in the evenings, watching his breath fog an air that smelled like snow and distant coal fires. His son was born in November. He learned about it through legal correspondence delivered with the same professional efficiency that had characterized all communication with Eveline since she'd refused Marcus's money. A boy. Healthy. Named Thomas after Eveline's father rather than following Ravenshire naming traditions. The legal documents made clear that Cedric had no rights to contest the name, no visitation privileges unless specifically granted, no role in the child's life beyond financial obligations that his reduced circumstances would make challenging to meet. He was a father, and a stranger to his own son. The news should have felt bigger, should have triggered some dramatic response or desperate action. Instead, Cedric just felt the weight of it settling like everything else he'd lost. His wife, his fortune, his illusions about himself. He'd brought a child into the world and would watch him grow from such distance that Thomas would likely know him only as the Duke who'd destroyed his mother's happiness and been left behind while she built something better. Another consequence that couldn't be fixed or negotiated or strategized away, just accepted. Cedric wrote a letter that night, knowing it probably wouldn't reach Eveline but needing to write it anyway. The words came slowly, stripped of aristocratic polish or careful phrasing. Just honest acknowledgement of what he'd destroyed and what he'd learned from the destruction. He wrote about the ballroom that would stay closed forever, about Marcus's betrayal and the lesson that power without wisdom was just another word for vulnerability, about the palace that felt smaller now, but more honest, reduced to dimensions he could actually manage instead of dimensions that required pretending he was better than he actually was. He wrote about understanding, finally, why she'd smiled so perfectly while planning her escape, about recognizing that strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the discipline to transform fear into strategy, about learning that some wounds didn't heal so much as teach you how to live around the scar tissue they left behind. Most of all, he wrote about the son he'd never hold, about hoping Thomas would grow up knowing his mother's strategic brilliance and moral clarity, about wishing he could be part of that growth while understanding he'd forfeited that privilege in a ballroom 6 months before his child was born. He signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Ashcombe Shipping and Trade, knowing Evelyn's staff would probably screen it and she'd likely never read past the first line. But writing it felt necessary anyway. Not for her, for him. For the man who'd learned too late that some apologies couldn't change anything but still needed to be offered because they were true. The letter went out with the morning post. Cedric never received confirmation it arrived, never got response or acknowledgement or any indication that his words had reached their intended audience. Just silence, which was its own kind of answer. Years passed like water over stone, slowly eroding what remained of the old Cedric until something different emerged beneath. The palace stabilized at reduced capacity. Cedric learned to manage estates personally instead of delegating to staff or family he could no longer trust. Learned the difference between maintaining appearances and maintaining actual function. Learned that respect, when built on competence instead of title, felt different but possibly more sustainable. He never remarried. Relationships seemed impossible when every interaction reminded him of how spectacularly he destroyed the one that mattered most. He attended social functions when required, but avoided the marriage market entirely, recognizing that women his age remembered his public humiliation of Evelyn, and the younger ones saw only a diminished Duke whose best years were already wasted. Reports about Evelyn filtered through occasionally, her shipping empire expanding, her son growing, her life apparently filled with success and dignity, and the peace that came from escaping situations that would have destroyed lesser women. She'd become what everyone had always known she could be, once freed from the weight of a marriage that had demanded performance instead of partnership. Cedric followed these reports with something between pride and grief, understanding that he'd been the obstacle preventing her excellence rather than the foundation supporting it. On the 5th anniversary of that catastrophic birthday party, Cedric received an unexpected letter with Norhaven postmark. Not from Evelyn. From Catherine Wells, the financial officer who'd delivered news of Evelyn's mercy 5 years earlier. The letter was brief and professional, but its content hit with unexpected force. Your Grace, the Duchess has asked me to inform you that young Thomas has expressed curiosity about his father. While the Duchess maintains her position regarding direct contact, she's willing to arrange limited supervised visits should you wish to meet your son. These visits would occur in neutral locations at times convenient to the child's schedule, with the understanding that any behavior deemed inappropriate will result in immediate termination of the arrangement. Please respond through legal channels if you wish to pursue this opportunity. Cedric read the letter 3 times, searching for conditions or complications hidden in the professional language. Found only the simple offer, a chance to meet the son he'd never held, to be something other than an absence in Thomas's life. Not out of forgiveness. The letter made that clear. Out of Evelyn's belief that children deserved to know their parents even when those parents had failed spectacularly. She was offering him access to Thomas not because Cedric deserved it, but because Thomas might someday want to understand where he came from. Another act of mercy from a woman who owed him nothing. Cedric's hands shook as he drafted his response, accepted the terms without negotiation, agreed to supervised visits and neutral locations, and the understanding that this privilege could evaporate if he proved unworthy of the trust being cautiously extended. The first meeting happened in a Norhaven park on a spring afternoon when Thomas was 5 years old. Cedric arrived early, wearing clothes that seemed adequate but not intimidating, trying to figure out how you greet a son who knew you only as a legal obligation and cautionary tale. Evelyn appeared with Thomas at precisely the agreed time. She looked older, but somehow younger simultaneously, stress replaced by confidence, the haunted quality of their marriage replaced by the calm of someone who'd survived disaster and emerged stronger. Thomas held her hand with the trust of children who'd never been given reason to doubt their mother's protection. He was small and serious-looking, with Evelyn's eyes and something of Cedric's jawline, a genetic compromise between parents who'd been terrible together but had somehow created something beautiful anyway. Thomas, Evelyn said gently, this is the Duke of Ravenshire, your father. Cedric knelt to be at eye level with the boy who carried his blood but none of his mistakes. Hello, Thomas. The boy studied him with unnerving directness. Mama says you live in a palace. I do. A much smaller one than you're probably imagining. Do you have dragons? No dragons, just gardens and empty rooms and portraits of ancestors who'd probably be disappointed if they were still alive to judge. Thomas considered this seriously. That sounds lonely. The observation hit harder than any accusation could have. Out of the mouths of children came the truths adults spent years learning to disguise. It is lonely sometimes, Cedric admitted, but I'm learning to live with that. Evelyn watched the exchange with unreadable expression, her hand still resting protectively on Thomas's shoulder. The visit lasted exactly 1 hour. Cedric showed Thomas how to skip stones on the park's pond, answered questions about the palace and whether dukes wore crowns and what it felt like to be important. He avoided explaining that importance was an illusion, that titles meant nothing without character, that he'd learned more about strength from watching Thomas's mother walk away than from any power he'd inherited. Some lessons were too complicated for 5-year-old children. When the hour ended, Evelyn gathered Thomas with the efficiency of women who'd maintained boundaries against men who'd once had unlimited access. Say goodbye to your father, Thomas. Goodbye. Thomas waved solemnly. Will I see you again? If you want to. If your mother agrees, I think so. Thomas looked up at Evelyn. Can we, Mama? We'll see. Her voice held the careful neutrality of parents protecting children from complications they couldn't yet understand. They left. Cedric stood in the park watching them disappear toward a life that had no space for him beyond carefully measured visits and supervised interaction. But for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than grief or regret or the weight of consequences that couldn't be escaped. He felt grateful. Genuinely, purely grateful that Evelyn had been strong enough to leave him, strategic enough to rebuild, and merciful enough to let him meet the son they'd created during the death throes of their marriage. The visits continued, monthly at first, then bi-monthly as Thomas grew older, and his schedule filled with school and friends and the ordinary architecture of childhood. Cedric learned to be a parent in dimensions smaller than he'd imagined, but more meaningful than he'd expected. Learned that fatherhood didn't require living with your child, just showing up consistently and honestly for whatever time you were given. Thomas asked questions Cedric answered with increasing truthfulness as the boy grew old enough to handle complicated answers. About the marriage that had failed. About the birthday party that had destroyed everything. About why his parents lived in different cities and communicated through lawyers instead of conversation. Why did you hurt Mama? Thomas asked at age 8, sitting in that same park where they'd first met. Because I was selfish and stupid and thought I could have everything without consequences. Cedric didn't soften it. Your mother deserved better than I gave her. Do you still love her? The question came with the directness of children who hadn't learned to disguise curiosity as politeness. I never stopped loving her, Cedric said quietly. I just loved myself more. And by the time I understood the difference, she'd already learned to live without me. Thomas absorbed this with the seriousness of children processing adult failures. Are you sorry? Every day. But being sorry doesn't fix what's broken. It just means you finally understand what you destroyed. The boy nodded like this made sense, even if the full implications would take years to fully comprehend. Evelyn rarely joined these visits. She maintained her distance, trusting Cedric with supervised access but never suggesting the boundaries should expand. Their communication remained professional, mediated by lawyers and carefully worded arrangements that prevented the kind of contact that might reopen wounds barely healed. But occasionally, Cedric would see her from distance, in the park watching Thomas, at Thomas's school performances, brief glimpses of the woman who'd escaped him and built the life he'd prevented her from having while they were married. She always looked happier than he remembered, more complete, like someone who'd discovered that peace was worth more than prestige and dignity, meant more than dynasty. He'd given her that, inadvertently, had been such a catastrophic husband that leaving him became liberation instead of failure. It was a strange legacy, but at least it was honest. On the 10th anniversary of that ballroom disaster, Cedric found himself standing in the closed space where everything had ended and everything had begun. The room remained exactly as it had been, chairs still arranged, tables still waiting. The desiccated birthday cake now dust and memory. His estate manager had asked again about clearing it, making the space useful again. Cedric had refused for the same reason he'd refused every previous request. Some monuments to failure needed to remain standing. He walked through the ballroom alone, remembering Evelyn's smile that had hidden devastation, remembering Selena's scarlet gown and his own arrogance, remembering the exact moment his world had started collapsing and he'd been too blind to recognize structural failure when it was happening in real time. 10 years. A decade spent learning what his wife had apparently known from the beginning, that strength wasn't dominance, love wasn't possession, and power without wisdom was just another path to destruction. The lessons had cost everything: his marriage, his fortune, the comfortable illusions that had made failure feel like success for 3 catastrophic years. But the lessons had stuck. And the man standing in this closed ballroom bore little resemblance to the Duke who'd destroyed everything here 10 years earlier. That man had thought he deserved whatever he wanted. This man knew that deserving had nothing to do with getting. That man had mistaken patience for permission. This man understood that silence was often strategy in disguise. That man had believed power meant never having to choose. This man had learned that real strength was choosing correctly when every option hurt. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Cedric turned, expecting staff, and found himself facing the woman he'd spent a decade understanding from carefully maintained distance. Evelyn stood in the doorway to the ballroom she'd last entered 10 years ago, looking at the preserved wreckage of her 21st birthday with unreadable expression. Cedric felt his heart doing something complicated, the same way it had every time he'd glimpsed her from distance, the same way it probably always would when confronted with the woman who'd been strong enough to leave him. Evelyn. His voice came out hoarse with surprise. Cedric. She stepped into the ballroom cautiously, as if the space itself might still hold infection from that terrible night. I heard you kept this room exactly as it was. I did. Why? Because forgetting what I destroyed seemed worse than remembering. She walked to where the birthday cake sat in its tomb of dust and time, reached out but didn't quite touch it. Thomas asked me to come, she said quietly. He's 10 now, old enough to understand what happened here. He wanted to see where his parents' marriage ended so he could understand where his life began. What did you tell him? That sometimes destruction is necessary for reconstruction, that some endings are brutal but honest, that you can't build something real on a foundation of lies, so sometimes you have to burn everything down and start over. Wise advice. I had good teachers. She turned to face him across the ballroom that held 10 years of silence. You taught me what not to accept. Marcus taught me to protect myself. And the ruins of this room taught me that walking away from disaster is sometimes the bravest choice available. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate but true. For all of it. For the humiliation and the betrayal and the 3 years of marriage where I gave you everything except what you actually needed. I know you are. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. I've known for years, but apologies don't rebuild what's destroyed. They just acknowledge the destruction. Is there anything I can do? Anything you need? Keep showing up for Thomas. Keep being honest with him about your failures. She said it without cruelty. Help him understand that mistakes don't define you permanently if you actually learn from them instead of just apologizing. I will. They stood in continued silence, 2 people who'd destroyed each other and somehow survived the destruction separately. Finally, Evelyn moved toward the door. Goodbye, Cedric. Evelyn, wait. He took a step forward without thinking. Can I ask you something? She paused but didn't turn back. Why did you refuse Marcus's money? The question had haunted him for a decade. You could have taken it and expanded your empire. Could have used my desperation against me the way I used your patience against you. Why protect me after everything I did? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of truths that had taken years to crystallize. Because breaking the cycle of cruelty mattered more than winning. Because teaching our son that strength doesn't require other people's pain felt more important than expanding my shipping routes. Because I'd rather be the woman who chose mercy over advantage then the one who proved she could be just as ruthless as the people who'd hurt her. She turned to face him fully, and for the first time in 10 years, her expression held something other than professional distance. You gave me 3 years of performing perfection while drowning slowly. I could have given you a lifetime of legal warfare and justified revenge. But that would have made me you, Cedric. And I spent too many years learning to be better than that to waste my freedom on becoming what I'd escaped. The words hit like absolution he didn't deserve, an understanding he'd spent a decade trying to reach. You were always stronger than me. No. Evelyn shook her head. I was just more afraid of becoming someone I'd hate than you were. Fear can be wisdom if you let it teach instead of control. She left the ballroom without looking back, her footsteps fading into corridors that had once held her prisoner and now just held memory. Cedric stood alone in the space where everything had ended, finally understanding what Evelyn had known from the beginning. That real strength wasn't dominating others, it was dominating yourself. Your fears, your weaknesses, your desperate need to feel powerful at any cost. That love wasn't possession or performance or the comfortable lie of people pretending compatibility while slowly destroying each other. That some mistakes were too large to fix, but small enough to learn from if you approached the lesson with humility instead of pride. The ballroom would stay closed, the dust would settle deeper, and Cedric would continue living in a palace smaller than his father's empire, but larger than his own capacity for self-deception. He'd never get Evelyn back, never rebuild what he'd destroyed in one catastrophic night of arrogance and spectacular miscalculation. But he had Thomas, had monthly visits and honest conversations and the opportunity to be a father who taught through acknowledged failure instead of fictional success. And he had the truth, finally. Stripped of comfortable lies and aristocratic pretense and the illusions that had made destruction feel like strength. The truth that Evelyn had walked away from him and won everything that mattered, while Cedric had stayed in the wreckage and learned something almost as valuable, that you could survive your own worst mistakes if you stopped defending them and started learning from them instead. It wasn't the ending he'd wanted 10 years ago, when he'd thought power meant having everything, but it was the ending he'd earned, and sometimes, in the mathematics of consequences and carefully measured redemption, earned endings were the only ones worth having. Blackthorn Palace settled into twilight. Cedric closed the ballroom doors, leaving the monument to failure undisturbed, and walked toward the parts of the palace that still held life. Tomorrow, Thomas would visit. They'd talk about school and friends and the ordinary architecture of childhood. And Cedric would show up, as he'd promised Evelyn, honest about his failures and committed to teaching his son that mistakes didn't have to be permanent sentences. They could be education, brutally expensive but ultimately worth the price if you actually paid attention to what the pain was trying to teach. He'd lost everything. His wife, his fortune, his illusions, his comfortable lies. But he'd gained something harder and more valuable, the understanding that strength wasn't never falling down. It was learning how to stand back up and walk forward, carrying the weight of what you'd destroyed, using it as ballast instead of burden. Evelyn had learned that lesson years ago, in a ballroom on her 21st birthday while watching her husband destroy their marriage. Cedric had learned it slowly, painfully, across a decade of consequences that couldn't be avoided or negotiated or bought off with title and money. But he'd learned it finally, completely, in ways that changed him from the man who'd brought a mistress to his pregnant wife's birthday into someone Thomas might someday respect. Not because he'd succeeded, but because he'd failed honestly and learned thoroughly and refused to pretend the lessons hadn't cost everything they'd taken. And in the ruins of Blackthorn Palace, where ghosts of better men watched from painted frames, Cedric understood at last what his father had tried to teach, and he'd failed to learn. That legacy wasn't what you inherited. It was what you left behind after surviving your own worst choices. His legacy would be small, a son who knew him honestly, a palace that survived, a life rebuilt from smaller but more sustainable materials than arrogance and blind assumption. But it would be his, earned through catastrophe and careful reconstruction. And sometimes, in the arithmetic of destroyed empires and second chances granted by people you didn't deserve, that was enough.